Hard Eyes is what happens when you put a serial killer in your favorite rom-com, and it actually works, and I really enjoyed my time with this movie, so let's talk about it. But as always, before we get started, if you're new here, my name is Erin, and I talk all things movies and TV, but really mostly movies, so if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. It would be greatly appreciated, and if you've already seen the movie, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments down below. But without further ado, let's talk about Hard Eyes. So in this, we follow a serial killer known as Hard Eyes who returns every Valentine's Day to target couples that are in love. And this time on the list are our main characters, Allie and Jay, who are played by Olivia Holt and Mason Gooding. Starting off with the good, and the first thing I have here is the performances, but more specifically the performances from Olivia Holt and Mason Gooding. They were really good together, they had great chemistry, and they were just a ton of fun to watch in this thing. They were also pretty funny together as well, and honestly, this entire movie had some pretty solid humor in it, but I'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, Olivia Holt and Mason Gooding played your typical rom-com couple where they pretend to hate each other for the entire movie, but they're low-key falling for each other as this movie goes on. For Olivia Holt, I haven't seen much of her work outside of what she did for Disney Channel, and then I've seen like a couple of episodes of Cloak and Dagger, but that's about it. So after watching this movie, I wouldn't mind seeing her in more rom-coms because I think she nailed every aspect of this role. She was funny, charming, and as I said before, just really entertaining to watch along with Mason Gooding. And I will say those same things for Mason Gooding. I wasn't really familiar with his work, but in this movie, he absolutely nailed every aspect of it, just like Olivia Holt did. And in my opinion, I do think Mason Gooding's character was the funniest character in the movie. There were just so many moments in this thing where he sounded exactly like his dad. There were a couple of moments in the theater where I was just like, man, is Cuba Gooding Jr. in this movie? Because it did sound that identical to his dad's voice. But anyways, I also like what they did with both of their characters. They were essentially both hopeless romantics, and we got to learn just enough about each of them individually to get us to care and cheer for this relationship. There were also some fun side characters, one being played by Gigi Zumbadu, who played Olivia Holt's best friend, and she was very much the crazy but very supportive best friend, and she was funny as well. So yeah, across the board, I thought the performances were really fun and everyone did a solid job. Next up for the good is the humor, and this is actually pretty funny all the way through, and honestly at times it felt more like a rom-com than it did an actual horror movie. And that's why I said at the start of the video, this is essentially a rom-com with a serial killer in it. Even though our main characters were on the run from Hard Eyes for most of the movie, which is something that is probably supposed to feel a little bit suspenseful and maybe even a little terrifying at times, it was actually pretty hilarious as well. A lot of the humor did come from the banter between Olivia Holt and Mason Gooding, and there were some genuine laugh out loud moments in there. It was clear that this movie didn't take itself too seriously and was clearly having fun at some moments, but even with that said, I know I've been describing this movie as a rom-com with a serial killer in it and that it has a bunch of humor, but even with that humor, I don't feel like it overshadowed the more horror and slasher elements of this film. So if you want to see this movie for those horror elements, don't worry because there is still plenty of that in this movie. I do think for the most part that they did a good job at balancing the humor and those horror elements. And that kind of leads me into my next point for the good, and that is the kills and those slasher elements. So as I just said, even though this movie does have a lot of humor, do not worry because if you came for the kills, there is plenty of that in this thing. It did not hold back on the blood and gore either. I mean, the opening scene for this movie has some pretty gruesome kills with a lot of guts, honestly, and that trend continues throughout this entire film. There are lots of creative kills, and you can definitely see where they took some inspiration from other slasher movies. Some of these kills may make you squirm a little bit, but if you're a true horror fan, you are going to love every second of it. Moving on to the so-so, and the only thing I have here is the actual serial killer, Hard Eyes. Now look, I love that Hard Eyes is an original villain, but man, I don't think I've ever seen someone struggle so much to kill two people. cool. Now, this may just be a me thing, but in this movie's universe, Hard Eyes is a very well-known serial killer who returns every Valentine's Day to kill more couples. And in the beginning of this movie, they built him up to be this unstoppable force, or at least it seemed like he was going to be this unstoppable force. That is, of course, until he ran into our two main characters, where it just seemed like he whiffed on killing them every time they had an interaction. And this almost added a humorous element to all of this, because at times I was like, man, this guy really sucks at being a serial killer, because our main characters, at least for the most part, were able to hold their own against him when it came to fighting him off. Now look, I get if the main characters die, then we don't have a movie, but at times they just made Hard Eyes look really weak and not this intimidating, unstoppable force that they introduced him to be at the beginning of the film. And finally, getting into the bad, and the only thing I have here is that there were certain aspects of this film that were pretty easy to predict. The third act was pretty generic in my opinion, but when it came to who was behind the whole Heart Eyes thing, they dropped little hints here and there throughout the movie that if you picked up on them, then maybe you could figure it out. But for me, there was this one specific moment that happened that kind of gave it away, so when we got to that big reveal, it wasn't all that surprising because you had kind of already figured it out beforehand. I'm not gonna say specifically when that moment was, but when that moment happened, for me, I was like, okay, that person is definitely Hard Eyes. It didn't ruin the movie for me at all, but it did take some of that mystery out of it. But overall, this is still a fun movie that I very much enjoyed my time with. Our two main characters are fun and have lots of chemistry, and there is plenty of humor between the two. Plus, the horror elements give you some great kills, so yes, this is a movie I would definitely recommend. Those are my thoughts on Hard Eyes. Be sure to let me know what you thought of the movie down in the comments, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, get your Eazy Apparel at shopeasyapparel.com. God bless, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.